6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, I'm Catherine. Welcome to 6 Minute English, where we engage in some lively debate and discuss 6 stimulating items of vocabulary. And let's start. Here's your cup of coffee, Rob.
Thanks. But what took you so long, Catherine?
Oh, sorry, Rob. I bumped into someone I knew in the cafe and we stopped for a chat.
OK, well, that fits well with today's show, where we're talking about cafes or coffee houses. Did you know, Catherine, that coffee houses were originally a meeting place for lively debate and intellectual discussion?
Really? Oh, I didn't know that, Rob. And a debate, by the way, means a discussion that a lot of people take part in. So how long ago was this debating society?
Well, the first coffee house was set up in Oxford in 1650, but they quickly became popular and soon they were all over London too. You paid a penny to get in, and this included access to newspapers and stimulating conversation.
If something is stimulating, it encourages ideas and enthusiasm. And I expect the coffee helped with that a bit, did it?
No, it certainly helps me first thing in the morning.
Which brings me on to today's question, Rob. How many cups of coffee do we consume in coffee shops or stores in the UK every year? Consume, by the way, is another word for eat or drink. So is the answer A, 2.3 million, B, 23 million, or C, 23 billion?
Well, I don't really know, but it's got to be a lot, so I'm going to go for C, 23 billion. That sounds like a lot of coffee, but I buy several cups a week, and I expect you do too, Catherine.
I do indeed. But I have to say, while I was getting our coffees earlier, there was nobody else in the cafe talking except me and my friend. Everybody else was sitting on their own, tapping away on their laptops. Let's listen now to Douglas Fraser, BBC Scotland's business and economy editor, describing the vibe, or atmosphere, in a typical 21st century cafe.
10 or so in the morning, the cafe has 5 people at tables with their backs to the wall, each staring into a screen, plugged in, ears plugged. The flow of bytes through this coffee shop's free Wi-Fi is transporting these customers to diverse destinations far from the person beside them. Collaborative working, a research grant application, a potential blockbuster novel, and inevitably someone distracted by kitten pictures on social media.
So the spirit of those 17th century coffee houses has disappeared then. No more lively debate and intellectual discussion.
It seems so, Rob. As Douglas Fraser says, many people sit alone, plugged into their laptops, and they're all doing different things. Working, writing, messing about on social media.
And I think the cafe owners should turn off the free Wi-Fi and force these cafe squatters to move on. I don't think people should be allowed to sit all day using the internet, hogging tables, and not talking to anybody. Especially when some of them don't even buy coffee.
That's a bit extreme, Rob. Cafe owners need customers, and they encourage people to stay by having comfy sofas and newspapers to read, and the free Wi-Fi. A squatter, by the way, is someone who lives in an empty building without paying rent. And if you hog something, you use most or all of it in a selfish way.
I suppose you're right, Catherine. Now, how about telling us the answer to today's question then?
OK, so I asked, how many cups of coffee do we consume in cafes or stores in the UK every year? Is it A, 2.3 million, B, 23 million, or C, 23 billion?
Well, I could sit in a cafe using their free Wi-Fi to research the answer, but I had a guess and I said 23 billion.
Well, you didn't need that free Wi-Fi, Rob, because you were absolutely right. 23 billion coffees per year works out on average at 45 cups per adult in the UK.
OK, I think it's time we look back at the words we learned today. Our first word is debate, a discussion that a lot of people take part in.
For example, I took part in a number of stimulating debates at school. Number 2, if something is stimulating, it encourages new ideas and enthusiasm. For example, it's hard to have a stimulating conversation with someone who's looking at their phone all the time.
That's very true. Let me just slide my phone into my pocket. There you go, out
Rob.
the way. Our next word is consume, another word for eating or drinking, but it can also mean to use. For example, my car consumes a lot of petrol.
Or how do I calculate my car's fuel consumption? So consumption there is the noun. Number 4 is vibe, which means the mood or atmosphere in a place. For example, Oxford is a city, but it has a small town vibe.
Well, I'm getting bad vibes from our next word, which is squatter. That's someone who lives in an empty building without paying rent. The building is called a squat. So, for example, I lived in a squat for 2 years.
Really? You squatted in a squat, Rob?
No, it was just an example. I am not a squatter.
Oh, so you've never squatted?
No, I haven't. Now, look, we're wasting time here. We need to move on to our final word, hog. If you hog something, you use all or most of it in a selfish way.
For example, Rob, you've hogged the only comfy chair. That's so selfish.
I admit it, Catherine, I'm a chair hog. That's the noun. OK, well, before we head off for another cup of coffee, please remember to check out our Facebook, Twitter and YouTube pages.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, this is 6 Minute English and I'm Catherine.
And I'm Sam.
Sam, how do you feel about tipping?
Tipping. You mean giving extra money to people in certain jobs for doing their jobs?
Well, I wouldn't put it quite like that, but yes, it's giving money to waiters and waitresses, hairdressers, taxi drivers. Money that's more than the actual bill.
It's a nightmare. I never know who to tip, how to tip, by cash or by card, how much to tip. Is it 10, 12.5, 20%, or even if I should tip at all, because in some places a service charge is automatically added to the bill.
Yes, tipping is a really complicated issue, which we'll be looking at in this programme. But to start with, a question. What is the biggest tip that we know that somebody gave? Is it A, $10,000? Is it B, 250,000 US dollars? Or is it C, 3 million US dollars? What do you think, Sam?
I'm going to go for $250,000.
Okay, well, we'll find out if you're right at the end of the programme. Now, back to the topic of tipping, and in particular, tipping people who work in restaurants. William Beckett runs a number of restaurants and he recently appeared on the BBC food programme. He was asked about his view of tipping. Now, as we hear him, listen out for this information. In how many cities does he say he currently has restaurants?
It is cultural, i.e. it differs from place to place. I mean, we have restaurants in London, we have a restaurant in Manchester, we're also opening a restaurant in New York, and those 3 cities have quite different attitudes to tipping. In London, the norm is, well, so it's there, it's on your bill. That's not the norm, for example, in Manchester, and it's not the norm in New York, where we're going to open a restaurant later this year.
So, first, how many cities does he currently have restaurants in?
That would be 2, London and Manchester. He's going to open one in New York later in the year, but it's not open yet.
And what does he say about tipping?
Well, he says that it's very cultural. What is the norm in one city is not necessarily the norm in another. The norm is an expression that means, as you might guess, what is normal, what is usual.
So in London, for example, a service charge is usually added to the bill, but in Manchester it isn't. So the policy in London and Manchester differs, which means, again, as you might guess, it's different.
There's another short expression that he used that I'd like to highlight. Before he talks about how the policies differ, he says i.e. These 2 letters stand for the Latin phrase id est. Now, we never say id est, but we do write and say i.e. We use it to show that what comes next is using different words to say what we have just said or written. So he says about tipping, it's cultural, i.e. it differs from place to place. It's cultural is a more general statement, and it differs from place to place is a more specific definition of what he means.
So, one difference is that in some places people prefer an automatic service charge so that they don't have to think about or try to calculate a tip. But in other places, people hate that. They want to decide who and how much to tip themselves. But do people actually make use of that freedom not to tip? Here's William Bucket again, and this time he's talking about New York.
New York, exactly the same. There's a tacit pressure to tip, but theoretically you just stand up and walk out. You don't. Everybody tips 20%, or there is a theory of an option. But people like that.
So he says there is a tacit pressure to tip. What does he mean by that?
Something that is tacit is not spoken, not said, yet it is still understood. So in New York, no one tells you that you have to tip, but everyone knows that you have to.
And because there's no service charge on the bill and no one tells you what to tip, you could just walk out after paying. He says that's theoretically possible. That means although it may be possible, it's actually very unlikely because of the tacit pressure and the way we behave.
But he does say people like that freedom not to tip, even if they don't actually use that freedom.
Right, nearly vocabulary time, but first let's have the answer to our question. Now, Sam, what is the biggest tip we know someone gave?
I thought 250,000.
Well, it was actually, believe it or not, a whopping $3 million US dollars. Yes. Now, on with today's vocabulary review.
Right, so we've been talking about tipping, the practice of giving extra money to, for example, waitresses and waiters.
To differ from is a verb which means to be different from.
The norm is what is usual or normal.
I.e. is a short form of a Latin expression and it means in other words.
Something that is tacit is not said, but is nevertheless understood.
And if something is theoretically possible, it can be done, but for different reasons it probably won't be. And that is where we must leave it today. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, this is 6 Minute English from BBC Learning English. I'm Neil.
And I'm Rob.
Fancy a game of food connections, Rob? So I'll name a place and you say the first food that comes to mind. Ready?
Yeah, sure, let's go.
Italy.
Pizza or lasagna? New York?
Hot dogs, of course, or maybe bagels. Now, how about Cornwall from the UK?
Oh, right. If it's Cornwall, it must be the famous Cornish pasty, right?
That's right. Cornwall, the region which forms the southwestern tip of Britain, is as famous for its pasties as New York is for hot dogs. In this programme, we'll be finding out all about Cornish pasties, and we'll hear how it's gone from humble beginnings to become a symbol of Cornish identity and spread around the world to Jamaica, Argentina and Brazil.
But what exactly is a pasty, Neil? Somewhere between a pie and a sandwich, right? A piece of pastry which is turned over and crimped along the side to make two corners.
And filled with different ingredients, which brings me to my quiz question for today, Rob. What is the traditional filling in an authentic Cornish pasty? Is it A, chicken, avocado and brie, B, beef, potato and turnip, or C, pork, onion and chorizo?
Well, chorizo is Spanish, isn't it? And avocado with brie doesn't sound traditionally Cornish, so I'll say B, beef, potato and turnip.
OK, Rob, we'll find out later if you were right. What's for sure is that the Cornish pasty has had a long history, as BBC Radio 4's The Food Programme discovered. They spoke to Dr. Polly Russell, a public life curator at the British Library. Here she is reading from one of the earliest mentions of pasties from the late 17th century.
There's a lovely bit here where he's describing what a housewife in Hertfordshire does, and he's talking about her way to make pork pies and pork pasties. Pies may be made and baked either raised in paste earthen pans or in pewter dishes, or in the shape of a turnover two-cornered pasties. So that's a very early reference to a pasty in the shape, I think, that we know it, but also being made specifically for labourers, to be feeding labourers on a farm at harvest time.
So the earliest pasties were made in pewter dishes, a traditional cooking plate made of a silver-coloured metal called pewter.
And they were eaten by agricultural labourers, workers doing physical farm work during harvest time, the weeks in autumn when crops like wheat are cut and collected from the fields.
But it wasn't only farmers and labourers who ate pasties. As well as its farms and fishing, Cornwall was famous for tin mines, as Ruth Huxley of the Cornish Pasty Association explains.
Pasties would have been eaten by lots of people who went to work, but it just worked perfectly down mines, and Cornwall became the world capital of mining. And so lots of pasties were made, lots of pasties were eaten, and then that mining community went all over the world and took the pasty with them.
Pasties were eaten by hungry workers involved in the mining industry, digging up materials such as coal or metals like gold, or in Cornwall, tin, from the ground.
So far, we've been talking about Cornwall, but you said the Cornish pasty has spread around the world, Neil. How did that happen?
Well, that's connected to the tin miners we just talked about. Here's Polly Russell again.
This is replicated not just in Mexico, but with migrants moving to America, to Minnesota, to Canada, to Australia. So anyone who travels to many of those places now will see foods which are incredibly reminiscent and familiar, and just like Cornish pasties.
In the 19th century, many Cornish tin miners emigrated, moving abroad to start a better life. Their pasty recipes were replicated or copied exactly in the new places where they landed, from America to Australia.
And that's why in many places around the world you can find food which is reminiscent of pasties, meaning it reminds you of something similar. In this case, the original Cornish pasty, with its traditional filling of... what was your quiz question again, Neil?
Ah, yes. I asked you what the traditional Cornish pasty filling was. You said...
I said B. Beef, potato and turnip.
And you were right. Ceslywina, Rob. That's Cornish for congratulations.
Heb grev, Neil. That's no problem.
In fact, those other fillings, chorizo, avocado and brie, really did feature in pasties entered for this year's annual World Pasty Championships, held in Cornwall every spring. Other pasty-inspired ideas include Argentinian chimichurri empanadas and spicy Jamaican patties.
So, the pasty is still going strong both in Cornwall and around the world.
Today we've been discussing Cornish pasties, a kind of filled pastry from the southwest of England, originally made in pewter dishes. That's a silver-coloured metal dish.
Pasties were eaten by agricultural labourers, farm workers bringing in the autumn harvest, the time when crops are cut and collected from the fields, and also by workers in the tin mining industry, digging up metals like tin from underground.
Later, when these miners emigrated to new lands, pasties were replicated, cooked again in the same way.
In fact, Cornish miners moved to so many new countries that today, almost every corner of the world has food reminiscent of, or reminding you of, the original Cornish pasty.
That's all for today. Join us again soon for more topical discussion and vocabulary on 6 Minute English. Goodbye for now.
Bye-bye.
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, this is 6 Minute English from BBC Learning English. I'm Sam.
And I'm Rob.
Rob, would you describe yourself as a wine connoisseur?
If you mean, am I someone who enjoys wine and knows a lot about it, then no. Although the enjoy part is true, particularly a nice glass of red.
Of course, wine might not be everybody's cup of tea, not something they like, but wine has been an important part of history and language.
And even if you don't drink alcohol, wine can be used as a commodity you can invest in and sell at an auction.
And that brings me to my quiz question, Rob. In 2018, a bottle of wine dating back to 1774 sold at auction in eastern France for a record-breaking price. Do you know how much it was sold for? Was it A, $20,800, B, $120,800, or C, $220,800?
I know wine can fetch a high price, but not as high as some of those options. So I'll say A, $20,800.
I'll reveal the answer later on. But let's talk more about wine now. A glass of the stuff can be sipped and savoured or just glugged.
Glug is a good word, meaning drink in large gulps or mouthfuls. Not something a wine expert would do, For some people, drinking and serving wine is almost an art form.
If you go to a restaurant, there might be a sommelier, a person whose job is to serve and give advice about wine. They may have had years of training to learn about the different types of wine and the individual flavours or aromas known as notes.
This job has fascinated journalist and author Bianca Bosca. She wrote a book called Cork Dorks.
And here she is, talking on the BBC World Service programme, The Y Factor, describing her fascination with sommeliers.
These were people who had taken wine, which I'd always thought of as a thing of pleasure, something you turn to after a long, stressful day, and turned it into something approaching sheer god-awful pain. They licked rocks to train their palates. They divorced their spouses to spend more time reviewing flashcards. They had hired voice coaches and memory coaches. They took dance classes to learn how to move more gracefully across the dining room floor.
Like me, Bianca thought drinking wine was a pleasurable activity, something that helped her relax after a long, stressful day. So she was surprised at how sommeliers turn this activity into something approaching sheer god-awful pain.
The word sheer is used to emphasise the amount of something, or to mean nothing but. She thought the work of a sommelier was nothing but pain. They seemed to dedicate their life to wine.
One thing a sommelier does is train their palate. This is their ability to distinguish and appreciate different tastes and identify types of good wine from their taste. I guess this is quite important.
But divorcing their spouses does seem a bit extreme. I'm afraid I wouldn't take it so seriously. I'll stick to drinking poorer quality, cheap red wine, sometimes called plonk.
Well, Rob, cheap wine doesn't always have to be poor quality. Interestingly, there is some evidence that shows we only think wine tastes better because it's more expensive.
Ah, yes, this is research Hilger Plasman from INSEAD Business School in France spoke about on the BBC World Service's Y Factor programme. She's been looking into what influences consumer behaviour.
The price tag affects that region in your brain that encodes your liking of the taste. So in other words, you do not only think that you like the more expensive wine more, you feel you like the more expensive wine more because your brain region that encodes this feeling is influenced by the price tag.
So our brain is possibly playing tricks on us. When we see the price tag on a bottle of wine, our brain encodes the information and tells us how it should taste. Encodes means changes the information into something that we can use or understand. Drinking more expensive wine makes you think it tastes better. So perhaps when buying a supermarket wine or wine in a restaurant, it may be better telling yourself that the cheaper option is okay.
I'll drink to that. But I wonder how that most expensive bottle of wine ever sold at auction tastes. The one dating back to 1774 that you asked me about.
So you thought it sold for $20,800, but sorry, Rob, that's too cheap. It was, in fact, sold for $120,800. I assume it wasn't drunk.
I hope not. Well, I think I'll stick to my plonk for now, Sam. Plonk was one of our vocabulary words today and describes cheap, poor quality wine.
We also mentioned a connoisseur, someone who enjoys a particular thing and knows a lot about it.
A sommelier is someone who serves and gives advice about wine in a restaurant.
Sheer is a word used to emphasise the amount of something, or to mean nothing but.
A palate describes someone's ability to distinguish and appreciate different tastes.
And finally, encodes means changes information into something we can use or understand. But now we're out of time, so cheers everyone.
Thanks for listening and goodbye.
Goodbye.
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.
Hello, this is 6 Minute English from BBC Learning English. I'm Sam.
And I'm Rob.
So, we're well into 2020 now. How are your New Year's resolutions going, Rob?
Resolutions. You mean promises people make to themselves to stop or start doing something. I promised to start running and to stop eating biscuits and to give up alcohol for a month. but I failed on all of them.
Oh dear.
Yes, I lasted a few days and then I started to crumble.
Yeah, well, you're not alone. Many people try to kick bad habits and get healthy when a new year begins. Their intentions, their plans to do something, are good.
Yes, giving up drinking is particularly good to do, if only for the health benefits.
Well, we'll be talking more about that as soon as I set up today's question. According to historians, which people were thought to be the first group to make New Year's resolutions? Was it the A, Romans, B, Native Americans, or C, Babylonians?
I haven't got a clue, so I'm going to guess A, the Romans.
Okay, Rob, I'll let you know if that was a good guess at the end of the programme. Now let's talk more about giving things up for New Year and specifically giving up alcohol.
It's a time often called Dry January. Dry refers to not drinking alcohol. It's not about the weather. And the beginning of the year seems like a good time to start doing something to improve your health.
But it's easy to give in to temptation, isn't it, Rob?
Oh, yes, and it's tough to give up drinking in the first place, as Millie Gooch, founder of the Sober Girl Society, knows. She spoke to BBC Radio 4's You and Yours programme and explained why it was hard to quit in the first place.
I think it's the peer pressure and, it's just so expected of us. It's so ingrained in us. Alcohol is everywhere and it's not just alcohol itself. It's like alcohol merchandise. So, you've got Christmas jumpers that have been saying Prosecco, ho, 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 and you can't buy a birthday card without it saying let the fun begin. It's just absolutely everywhere. It's so hard to avoid.
So that's Millie, who's right when she says that in the UK, at least, we sometimes drink because we give in to peer pressure. That's the influence a group of similar people have on you to behave like them.
We want to be part of the group, so we copy what they do. And we are expected to do so because, as Millie said, drinking alcohol is ingrained in us. Well, in some cultures anyway.
And when an attitude is ingrained, it means it's been that way for a long time. It's difficult to change. And although it may be harmful, we see jokes about drinking through things like merchandise, a word for goods we buy and sell.
And Millie goes on to say we can buy jumpers that joke about the Italian sparkling wine called Prosecco, which say Prosecco ho ho ho. And birthday cards have the message let the fun begin, a play on the word begin.
With all this social pressure, it's hard not to give in. And that's even worse when you're trying to fulfill your resolution not to drink.
For Millie, enough was enough when drinking started to have a negative effect. And she had to do something about it. Let's hear from her again.
I started realising that alcohol was actually really affecting my mental health. So I was getting that really bad hangover anxiety, that like hangover fear and dread. And I kind of noticed that was permeating my everyday life. I was a binge drinker rather than like an everyday drinker. So I just decided that, it wasn't suiting my life anymore and I wanted to give it up.
So Millie there described the negative effects of a hangover. That's the sick and tired feeling you get after drinking too much alcohol. She also said she felt anxiety, and this feeling was permeating her everyday life. When something permeates, it spreads through something and influences every part of it.
So drinking was affecting her everyday life, and it didn't help that she was a binge drinker. When you binge, you do something occasionally, but too extreme.
Well, Millie managed to quit drinking and hasn't touched a drop since. There are many benefits to remaining sober. That means not being drunk. And one of them is hearing the answer to today's question.
Earlier I asked you, according to historians, which people were thought to be the first group to make New Year's resolutions? Was it the A, Romans, B, Native Americans, or C, Babylonians? And Rob, what did you say?
I had a wild guess and said it was the Romans.
Sorry, Rob, you are wrong. Many historians think it was the Babylonians who made the first ever New Year's resolutions, about 4,000 years ago. According to the History.com website, at New Year, which they celebrated in mid-March, Babylonians made promises to the gods to pay their debts and return any objects they had borrowed.
I wonder if they managed to keep their resolutions for longer than I did. Anyway, let's keep one of our regular promises to recap the vocabulary we've discussed today, starting with resolution.
Which in the context of New Year's resolution is a promise to yourself to stop or start doing something.
Peer pressure is the influence a group of similar people have on you to behave like them.
Ingrained describes an attitude or idea that has been done in a certain way for a long time and is difficult to change. And merchandise is a word for goods we buy and sell.
We also mentioned a hangover. That's the sick, tired and sometimes anxious feeling you get after drinking too much alcohol. And permeating describes spreading through something and influencing every part of it. Like the vocabulary in this programme, Sam.
Thanks, Rob. And that's all for now.
Bye-bye.
6 Minute English.
From BBC Learning English.